Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this month's Acting for Justice event. My name is Jack Jezreel, and I serve on the staff of Just Faith Ministries. I'm joined, as always, by my colleague, Leela Oakley, and we're very glad you could join us tonight. I thought tonight we could start with a reflection from Pope Francis in a homily from January 6, 2021. He makes this observation. A journey always involves a transformation, a change. After a journey, we are no longer the same. There is always something new about those who have made a journey. They have learned new things, encountered new people and situations, and found inner strength amid the hardships and risks they met along the way. No one worships the Lord without first experiencing the interior growth that comes from embarking on a journey. Amen. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter. William Morris is a climate activist located near a Torrance, California refinery. He holds a degree in environmental science from Humboldt State University. William is a faith organizer with Green Faith, working on the People versus Fossil Fuels campaign. He also works with young evangelicals for climate action, serving as a field organizer and now as the chair of the steering committee. William's work has been featured in Rolling Stone magazine, ABC News, and the BBC. And William, we are very glad to have you with us tonight. So it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Jack and Layla. It's wonderful to be here with you all. So grateful to share this space together with so many folks. Yeah, and as Jack said, my name is William. I was born and raised just outside of Los Angeles, California, which is the Tongva land, unceded Tongva land here. And I've been here all my life. This is, the place I was born and raised. And as Jack mentioned, I also live down the street from a refinery. And so I'll dive in a little bit about what does it look like living near fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure, and how does that affect our community, and growing up as a person of faith, and now, spending my time doing faith-based climate justice activism. I often hear from people that's the first time I've heard of, these sorts of things. And I'm glad in this room that's not the first time you all have heard of it. So I'm excited to have a conversation with you. So let me share my screen. Okay. Can folks see that? Okay, great. I always like to put my email in case you want to reach me. More than happy to talk. Love when folks reach out. But let me get started by talking about what it's like to live by fossil fuels. And so this is a picture of the Torrance refinery, which is down the street from my house. And there's homes and neighborhoods surrounding it. You can see the flaring event that's happening there. And I can remember all of these times through elementary to high school where we'd have to run inside and shelter in place because gas would escape the refinery. This gas that was harmful for us to breathe in would go off, our bells and things and we'd have to run inside as kids. And this refinery was actually only about a block from my high school. You can see it from the second story of our classrooms. In fact, it was the main view out of the back of my environmental science class. So the irony of that. But it was close enough to where the teacher could point and talk, and we just could turn around and we really understood. Here's another photo of it. You can see kind of how sprawling and big it is on the left, and then on the right, you can see about 10 years ago, there was an explosion. There was a problem at the refinery and caused a 2.0 magnitude earthquake, and ash rained down on our community. And so just a reminder of the dangers of living by some of this fossil fuel infrastructure and what it's like to grow up near it. I can remember me and my friends growing up, we're used to it. We didn't know any better, that not everyone lives next to a refinery. And then many of us went off to college and started talking to others, and they said, that's not normal. to live near these things, and people shouldn't have to do that. In other neighborhoods near me, we have neighborhood oil drilling. So you would think that a green state like California, as people like to see us, would have rules against drilling for oil in their homes, schools, hospitals, and churches. But that isn't the case. And so even states like Texas have setback rules where you can't put these things so close to where people are living, to where they're working, to where they're playing, to where they're worshiping. Um, but here we have neighborhood oil drilling. In fact, where I live now is just a couple miles from the largest urban oil field in the entire country, which is here in the city of Los Angeles. And so this is kind of the landscape I have grown up in, is one surrounded by this fossil fuel infrastructure, surrounded by this pollution, surrounded by these like Superfund sites. There's lots of environmental degradation that folks are having to deal with. And so this next slide is just another photo of an oil derrick that's right next to a home. And so these things are putting different harmful substances into the air that folks are breathing in, giving them all kinds of health problems, cancers, etc. And so it's really, yeah, it's a struggle for the folks who are living here. But that's a little about my place. And I always like to know where other people are coming from. So if you put that in the chat, just where you're calling in from, that would be wonderful. So I can take a look at that later. I always like to share this map of the US, and this is of the different ecoregions in the United States. And it overlaid is kind of the state boundaries. You can see them in there, but also how they don't really make sense to our ecology in the US. And so when we think of our place, people think of counties and states and towns, but I like to think of them in this way, in these different regions. And so on this map, I'm way down in the bottom left corner by that number 6, and it is this chaparral Mediterranean ecoregion that I live in that is somewhat dry, not quite a desert, a lot of rain, but it informs the place that I live. This next map is another one to help break up these man-made boundaries that we have, but this is a map of watersheds in the United States. So you can see that massive one in the middle that takes up about a third of space is the Mississippi, and all these various other ones that are flowing through different state boundaries, through cities and counties and towns. And I like to show this to talk about the connection that we share. We may live in these different places, whether it be upstream or downstream, but really we are incredibly connected. And I think viewing these things helps us look at the world in a different way. So that was a little about place. And now I want to talk about, I grew up in the church. I grew up in a very conservative white evangelical church. You may know the kind where they say the earth is 6,000 years old and evolution is fake and dinosaurs existed at the same time as people. And our church growing up very much held the view of the photo on the left, that man is above everything else, and that we can treat creation and nature however we want for our own gain. And, even when I was a child back then, that didn't make sense to me. I grew up loving science in school. I loved nature documentaries on PBS during the week. My parents and like my family would sit down and watch these together. And I saw this beautiful and connected world. And then I'd go to church and they would tell me the world is fallen and sinful and we shouldn't want anything to do with it. And so there was very much this big disconnect between the two of what I knew was right and what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And going to church and hearing, we have dominion over everything and we can use it how we please. And I'm sure others of you here have felt that. And that's why you're in this space. And I'm glad we can be here together. And that disconnect for me continued well into college, where I found I was one of the only Christians in my science classes and one of the only people at church with a science major. And I could not reconcile that in myself. And so I began going to different churches and talking about creation care and theology and about these aren't separate things, these are together. And this is something that young people care about. All of my peers in school knew that, our climate is changing. You didn't have to argue with them. You didn't have to tell them any different. They already knew. It was oftentimes the older folks in different congregations who would put up a fight and say things like, why should we care? It's going to burn up anyways, or we're going to get a new heaven and a new earth. And so very much that left side of the picture thinking we're above everything and we are in control. But after giving many of these talks, some which didn't go well, some which did, I learned that once I focused on talking about the climate crisis and environmental injustices and how they're affecting people, especially the most vulnerable ones, as I'm sure you know, that those who've contributed least to our climate crisis are getting hit first and they're getting hit worst. And so don't get me wrong that, polar bears and the ice caps aren't important. They completely are as part of our ecology and environment. But people don't always connect with that the same way as when you tell them about how different the world is going to be for their kids and for their grandkids. And now some of these people that I've given these talks to a few years ago have come back to me and said, I'm seeing it happen, in my own lifetime now, in these past several years. And so I think overall, my view growing up in church and science has shifted very strongly about how do we get away from this left side and how do we get towards this right side where we see ourselves as connected. When we think back to those maps at the beginning, how do we live in a more connected way? And so I'm sure some of you have struggled talking with folks about how climate change is happening, it's too late. What are we going to do? We're just humans. We couldn't have done that. And the good news is that the deniers are very few. They may seem loud, but this is an infographic from the Yale program on climate change communication. And it talks about what is the American public's belief in, they call it global warming and climate change. And so as you can see from this graph, the dismissives are only about 11%. So you have 90% of people who are open and willing to listen if they're not alarmed and concerned already. And so we get to decide how much time do we want to spend trying to shift people who don't want to be moved, or do we want to spend our time trying to move someone from disengaged to cautious or cautious to concerned? How do we best use our time and our energy so that it is being put in a good place and we're amongst people who want to be in relationship with us and listen to us, because it certainly doesn't feel good to go into a place and have someone not believe you and not want to hear what you have to say. And so one of the best things that we can do, and this is something that climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe says as well, is to just talk about the climate crisis. And it may seem so simple, but if you think about in the past month, how many conversations have you had about it? I'd say for most of us, it's not a ton, maybe one, maybe two. But when we look at this infographic, we know 90% of people are thinking about this and taking this seriously in some way, shape, or form. And we just need to talk a little bit more about it. When we can talk about it with our friends, we can talk about it with our family. And oftentimes I come across people who are a little confused because they don't know the ins and outs of climate change, and they feel like not equipped because they're not a scientist, but they know something is off. They know the past few summers haven't been quite the same. For instance, in LA, we've had 2 very wet winters where there's just been atmospheric river after atmospheric river drop record amounts of rain across our state, and people are a little freaked out. It's great that we have water. We've been in drought for a decade, if not more. But people have noticed that, hey, this is not normal, and are wanting to talk about it. And so talking to friends and family is like a really low stakes, easy way, because these people in our lives are thinking about it. And the next level beyond that is like, how do we talk to our congregations and our institutions about it? Because these are places that can help serve our community and the places around us. These are places with resources that are either financial or otherwise. Maybe our congregation has a kitchen. Maybe it has a shelter. Maybe it could be a resilience hub for when power goes out. But how do we look at our faith institutions as places that are serving people as they're supposed to be in the context of our climate crisis? And the next thing in this easy realm of talking about it is just talking with our elected officials and talking about how concerned you are. It's actually really easy to talk to them. I remember the first few times I was incredibly nervous to go because they seem so official and all these different things. But they wanted to hear from, the people who lived in their district. And so we got together some folks from our congregations to go talk, and we just share our concern about our faith and climate and how we're not doing a great job of caring for our earth, and what does that look like in the place that we live. And so some elected officials are going to listen more and some are not, but we have power, especially as people of faith, and being this moral voice that people tend to listen to. Uh, and so speaking of our faith and our moral voice, I want to share this next slide with you. And this is from Sherry Mitchell. She's an Indigenous lawyer, author, teacher, and activist. In her book, Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change, she says, when we are born into this world, our umbilical connection is transferred from our birth mother to our earth mother. Our umbilical connection with the earth mother then nurtures and sustains us for the remainder of our lives. And so she's talking about this spiritual connection that we have to the earth. She says there is this essence of an indescribable etched upon our souls, and there is a stirring within us. That stirring is a call of recognition, of remembrance. And I imagine since all of you are here, you feel that stirring inside of you. When it comes to our current context today, a world in the midst of climate crisis, what can we learn from the earth, our earth mother, our relation? And I say that earth is our relation because in so many creation stories from around the world, humans come from the earth itself. This is both true in creation stories and evolution as well, that we humans are the ones who are really new to this earth, kind of these recent arrivals. The earth's been around a long time. There's been life on this earth a really long time. And we've kind of just got here. And so how do we, as these new ones, do well to heed the wisdom of the earth that was here before us, the life here before us, and the wisdom of this earth that has birthed us? What does it look like to listen to those who've lived with the land and in harmony for a very long time? Is that incorporated into our faith? And so when it comes to our faith, what is our call to respond? Oftentimes, there's so many stories in our sacred scriptures that tell us to love one another and care for this shared place that we call home. But how are we going about that? We know that the climate crisis is because of greed and extraction. There are these few people who have taken resources, who are profiting off the suffering of many. And as people of faith, we get to respond with moral clarity and use our faith language, use our sacred scriptures, our sacred stories in saying that it's wrong. Not getting into debates that it's complicated or what about our shareholders or what have it, that we have a guiding light in us that says we're here to do the right thing, no matter what. And another strength of our faith is that there's always hope. Sometimes when I talk with folks about climate who think it's too late to do anything, we often talk about their loved ones. If they were diagnosed with an illness and there was no cure, do you abandon them and leave them in the hospital, or do you pull up a chair and sit close and embrace them? And you know that time is more precious because it's finite. And so as people of faith, we're called to be compassionate and we're called to be loving right to the very end, no matter the outcome. I think that is what is so great about people of faith, is this consistency in doing the right thing. That is our strength, that even if we were to do all the right things and it wouldn't be enough, we would still do them because that's what we're supposed to do. And luckily, that's not the case when it comes to climate, that we have so much time to prevent things from getting worse. Don't let anyone scare you into saying it's too late, because before they would say that it's too far off, and all of a sudden it's too late. That doesn't quite make sense. That every action we take to reduce the warming on our Earth is lessening suffering, and so there's always more that we can do. I think about oftentimes this myth that I hear. Um, Sometimes it started around COVID. I heard it more, but that the myth that the worlds would be better without humans, that somehow we're the virus, and that we mess things up and get in the way. I often learned this in my conservation classes when it came to like national parks and why we don't allow people to live there. It's because people, can't be trusted. If we let them trample through the forest or these different things, they're going to mess things up. But that is really this Western worldview of humans having a negative impact with nature. Because calling back to Sherry Mitchell and what she said is that we're connected to this earth. That's not a negative relationship, that this is a symbiotic one. And so there is a different worldview we can hold that many indigenous people hold, that we are in relationship and humans interacting with the earth is a good thing. Um, I think back to some of my classes in college when we learned that there was these civilizations in South America living on the Amazon River. And if you know anything about the Amazon rainforest, the soil is very poor. All of the nutrients are stored in the trees. It's really hard to farm there, to grow and to do anything. And yet they found where these indigenous folks were living with the land, that the soil was fertile. It was rich. It had been improved. And so these folks who lived there spent the time to make the soil better. They were not taking from their environment, they were putting in. And that went against all of our conventional ecological knowledge and our knowledge on humans interacting with the land. Because oftentimes when we think of humans interacting with the land, we think of things like the Dust Bowl, where we have done too much and taken too much, and it has caused these negative repercussions. But um, that is not always what can happen. We have choices about how we interact with the land around us. And that connection that we have to the land comes in so many ways. I think of um, back in Northern California, there are many dams that block salmon from migrating upstream. And they found that the redwood trees, some of the tallest trees, oldest trees in the world, were suffering and they were missing nutrients. And it turns out that because we built these dams, we cut off salmon from their natural habitat, swimming up into the forest where they would spawn and then pass away. And so these redwood trees were missing nutrients that had sustained them for many, many years, many generations from the salmon, because we had built dams. And so this connection from the rivers to the forests, to what we as humans have done, this connection can be seen in a ton of different places, like in Wyoming, where they were ranching and there was a lot of livestock. And so they decided that we were going to be able to kill off the wolves so we could protect all of our ranching livestock. And then they found that the fish population really began to plummet after that decision, and they could not figure out why. But then they began to look at these natural cycles and they said, well, the loss of wolves means more deer, which means the deer eat more of the vegetation by the streams, which means the streams are bare, and the sediment falls in and makes the water too cloudy for the fish to spawn. And so that these earth connections that are around us are a multitude. This is just a few examples. And a lot of times, if you grew up like me in a very conservative Western Christianity, we often dissect the earth into how do we understand it? We want to know the most about it instead of how do we engage in a reciprocal relationship. If you think about oftentimes what you get told is if you're going on a hike or going out into nature, is you need to take a lot of water. Nature is very scary. It doesn't care about you. And so you need to be prepared. When if you think about the opposite, or if you think about it, the opposite is true, where if you are in relationship with the land that you're on. Creation takes care of you. It provides everything you need to eat, to drink, provides shelter, it provides medicine. And so our mindset shifting from how can we extract from nature? How can we turn it into a commodity? To how do we live in relationship with it? But that means we can't profit off of it, is a big thing that has to change. And so we as people of faith need to look at that and look at our faiths all took place um, in a specific place, right? They took place in a specific place, specific people in a specific time. And a lot of times these wonderful lessons and gifts we receive out of them are coming from that place-based knowledge. And so for us to look at the creation around us and live our faiths in a place-based way, what does that mean for us? It's going to look different for me as someone who is from Los Angeles, who grew up with that oil drilling that you saw at the beginning. What does it mean for me as a person of faith to be faithful to the place I'm on and to the community I'm on? That's going to look different for someone who's in a different, one of those different ecoregions that I presented earlier. And I want to go to this next slide to further cement that to be human is to be part of creation, and we must learn how to be human from creation. And so this is coming from Dr. Keolu Fox, who is Kanaka Maoli, which means Native Hawaiian. He's an anthropologist and a genomic researcher. And he made this statement. He said, the land itself and the conditions of the land, like altitude and climate, impact our genome just as our human ancestors do. We are born on it, die on it, we come from it, and return to it. The land is a part of us, a relative in a very real way. Stones are relatives. Whatever I eat has been taken up from nutrients in the ground, including minerals, and the stones and the land become a part of me. The thunderstorm and the rivers become a part of me. The land has absorbed the blood and sweat of generations, watched babies become old men and women and return to the earth, return to the waters. We are part of each other. Civilizations rise and fall, and the land continues. It holds the memory of us all. Standing before a presence that large and old, and making one-sided claims of ownership is an extraordinary act of hubris. So there's some different takeaways from this, and one that is when Indigenous people say they're from the land or descended directly from the land, it's a fact. But second, what does it mean for us? I remember going to some churches and talking to people who've said, you know, my family has been here for 4 or 5 generations, that they've worked the land they're on, that it's become a part of them. And this is a very real way that that is true. And so I ask, what does it look like for us who are made up of the land we're on? So what does it look like for me, someone who is Japanese American and white? I'm mixed. And so what does that look like as a person of faith to relate to the land that I'm on? My white side is Irish and Italian. They came from England and then some to Canada, some to the East Coast to be part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. My Japanese side came from the city of Kochi in Japan to Los Angeles. We were forced into incarceration camps during the Second World War. They went to Manzanar at the bottom of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, then to New Jersey because Japanese people couldn't live on the West Coast. And then they finally returned to Los Angeles. So what are the responsibilities I have to the land that my family and my ancestors have been on? What has been lost through this time of people moving around and being transient? There is so much land knowledge that is there that only is there if we slow down and if we listen. But what is there to be gained by remembering? Some of the biggest breakthroughs I have working in congregations are when they plant a garden in their church space. Some of them will tear out a spot in the parking lot if they have really no other options. Some will do planter boxes. Some will do living walls, but just some way for them to interact with the soil, with the land on which they're at. And it changes people profoundly in a way that other things can't, in a way that reading books can't, because these are people who are sticking their hands into the soil, into the land on which they are residing, on which their congregation is residing, and doing so as a community and having a remembering of what it means to live in a place and to serve your community and to do that in a time of climate crisis. I mentioned Sherry Mitchell's book, Sacred Instructions, earlier. And in the second chapter of that book, there's a Chickasaw poet named Linda Hogan. And she writes, "Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands. We are all connected to those who came before us, and we're all connected to the earth. You're the result of the love of the earth and the love of the people." So I want to stop there for a moment before we go into our breakout rooms, so I can read where people are from. Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio, Richmond, Virginia, Roseville, Minnesota, Illinois, California, Wyoming, Washington, Massachusetts, Colorado, near the Martinez refinery, Austin, Texas, northwestern Wisconsin. Seen lots of regions around the United States that are represented. And so my pondering for when we go into our small groups is that we're all people coming from a specific place that you typed in the chat, people of faith in a specific place, maybe wanting to get more connected to the land, maybe not connected enough. But what does it look like to be a person of faith who is responding to this vocation to care for the earth, responding to this vocation in this time of action on our climate crisis in your particular place? Because it's going to be different for all of us. A lot of times at the end of my talks, people are like, what's the most important thing I can do? What's the one thing that everyone can do? And I always ask, where are you from? Because that question is not going to be the same for everyone. That answer is not going to be the same for everyone. So I want to take some time for us in our groups to think about our context. What is your community like? What are the needs that are there? Are there frontline communities near where you live who are in places like I grew up, suffering directly from fossil fuel infrastructure, from climate change? What does it look like as a congregation, as a person of faith, to respond to your neighbors in that way? If you don't live near a frontline community, what does it look like to use your congregational resources to support some of those communities? Maybe it's financially, maybe it's hosting space, maybe it is providing events at your church for your community to come and learn more. But what does that look like as a place-based person of faith responding to our climate crisis? So I will close with that open-ended question.
Great. William, thank you. Just very well done. So appreciate your encouraging words. So now we're going to give all of us a chance to talk. We're going to break into small groups for about 10 minutes. And we're going to use William's prompt of thinking about where you're from and what does it mean as a person of faith to act on behalf of our planet Earth. And you might think about what you'd like to do, what you're currently doing, what you feel compelled by, and pick any of those routes and you can share with others. So as soon as I stop talking, Leela's going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room. Please join in, share your thoughts, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes for some Q&A time with William. Thank you. We're going to ask William now to respond to some questions. You're free to send your questions to me and I'll kind of filter through them and then pass them over to William. And so, William, let me start with this question. It's maybe a little long, but I, I, I was listening to a podcast and it was right on the topic that you brought up. The thing that people want to know is what should I do? What can I do next? Only this particular podcast was what's the most impactful thing I can do next? And they settled on a particular viewpoint that ultimately, if you want to make, spend your time on the thing that has the biggest possible impact, get involved somehow in social policy, get involved in the political conversation. I was just going to ask you, how you would respond to the same question if someone told you, look, William, I can do anything you tell me to do. Just point me in the direction of how I can most impact on the climate change issue. And how would you respond?
Right. That is a great question. Thank you, Jack. And I think if you ask 100 different people, you might get 100 different answers. You might get more answers than that, to be honest. And I don't know if there is any wrong answer either. I think that it comes in different levels where some of us feel the burden, especially of individual responsibility. And I need to live my life in a zero waste way. I want to have the least amount of impact on the earth and the people around me. And that's practicing what I preach. I can't say I care about these things and live, a life of excess. And so there's the individual level. And then there is this community congregational level where you have a bunch of people who are like that and coming together and saying, how do we change our institution, our congregation, to be more sustainable and live that way? What are the sermons we preach at our church? What are the policies we have? How do we hold our events? How do we say these things? That's another level. And another level is, your county or your state. How do the congregations in the county? I know I'm at a United Methodist church, so like, how does our conference here in Southern California and Hawaii, who are all connected, what is their responsibility in doing these things in their region? And then it expands from there. So like nationally, what is our denomination's response? What do we do together? And so I think when you think of all those things, it lands back again to place, to where am I and what is the context am I in and how do I do each of those above things well, to steward the place I'm on well, the place that makes up my physical body, that makes up my spirit, that has sustained me. And what is my responsibility to that in an individual way? That way I am living in right relationship with the land. What does that look like at this next level, that congregational, institutional level? And what does that look like even higher up on a policy level? And so I think all of those are important, and it's really hard to have some and not the other. It would be really hard to talk with someone who says, all I do is policy work, but I haven't tried to make any changes in my own life. That just doesn't track and make sense. And so I think it's a good question, and I think there is no shortage of things. There's no wrong thing that you're doing, but how to think about it at those different levels for the place on which you're living.
William, you do a good bit of speaking around the country, and I'm just wondering if you could share with us a story of hope where you encountered something that was just so good, you got to share it with everybody.
Absolutely. That's a great question, and it'll come from right here in Los Angeles, where I shared about the neighborhood oil drilling earlier. That has been something that has been a huge problem for a very long time, and there were a few groups of people who were just tired of it. They were tired of seeing their neighbors suffering. They're tired of seeing the health effects. They were tired of seeing oil drilling next to schools with kids. And so they got together in the community, and it was different organizations, including churches. Some of them were doctors and nurses. Um, some of them were just nonprofit organizations. And they got together and formed something called the Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling Coalition here in LA. And that was about 10 years ago. It was just these community members, these regular people, not anyone with any position of power, not anyone who was well known. Like these were just people who saw their neighbors suffering and wanted to do something about it. And so over the past 10 years, they have gone from just this random collection of people of faith and doctors and community members and teachers to the organization who has got the city of Los Angeles to say that we are going to phase out all oil drilling. Regular people were able to lift up the stories of their neighbors. They were able to build power in their community. They were able to use moral language and their moral voice in saying, this is wrong. This is ethically wrong to profit off of the suffering of our neighbors. And especially for those who live really close, they have friends and family who suffer directly from different, respiratory issues, cancers, all sorts of things from living near these sites. I know someone whose sister got cancer and passed away because she lived on an apartment complex that was built on an old drill site, and different people in the complex all got the same types of cancer. And so regular people said, this is not right. This is something morally wrong. This is something we want to take a stand against. And in using that language and not giving up, and in doing that in community and not alone, they were able to take it all the way up to that policy level, where they were able to say, get the city to admit that this is something we shouldn't be doing anymore, and that we're going to, over time, phase out oil drilling in the city. And that's just the city of LA, not the county or the state yet, but they're working on that next. And so I always think that that is such an incredibly hopeful thing, that these seemingly average everyday people who they're not scientists, they weren't policymakers, none of these different things, but because of their compassion and their care for their community and the people around them, that is what led to such an enormous, monumental change.
Fabulous. Thank you. That's a great story. All of us are living in this context of the great divide, if you will. Churches, communities, even families are divided because they have trouble talking about anything that, kind of speaks to left or right. And I'm wondering, this is maybe even a tougher question. Have you seen examples of where faith communities that have been maybe traditionally disinclined to talk about matters of climate or environment find their way to doing that? And, how did that happen, if you have any stories to tell?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I definitely feel that all the time in the work that I do. And at the very beginning, one of the organizations Jack mentioned that I work with is one called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. And so that very much is a group where the audience is people who have grown up in these conservative evangelical spaces, but also are seeing what's happening to our earth and wanting to respond and act on climate. And so oftentimes, yeah, that's one of the hardest groups to be moved, is if you look at white evangelicals. And so the way that works, even through the divide and not agreeing on a lot of things, is boiling down to the base things that we want. It's all of us want to feel safe. We all want to be healthy. We all want our families to feel safe and taken care of. We all want a certain quality of life. We all want to, live in a connected community. All of these different base needs that we have are really the same. And so that's oftentimes how we go about that language, is even if someone is one of those deniers and doesn't believe in climate change being human caused, we can talk about other effects like pollution and environmental injustice. It's much harder to deny when you see oil drilling happening next to a church or in the parking lot of a hospital or an oil spill. on the ocean. There's these different things that we can tap into, that everyone believes that, and that's just our core needs, as human beings, to be loved, to feel safe, to be in community. And so oftentimes framing it through that lens of, hey, the work we're doing is in service of those goals. We're not trying to like have this big government take over, like regulation, all these different things that they're kind of scared of. Oftentimes is what they hear on the news, reading the newspaper. They hear these things. We're trying to take away your gas stove. Like those are kind of the fears, is they're going to lose their autonomy. And so the conversation is different. It's no, we want you to have a better quality of life. We want your children and their children to have a better quality of life. And normally that is some common ground that we can agree upon and go from there.
William, if there were three organizations that you could recommend to folks to sort of look into because they offer a portal for engagement or additional learning, name three that come to mind in your experience.
Yeah, definitely. Oh gosh, there's so many. Um, uh, if you're taking notes, I'll list a few off. One of them that I work with is Green Faith, and so that's a multi-faith climate justice organization who looks to mobilize people out of their congregations, and use your moral voice, to be bold for good, to protect our sacred earth. Um, and there's different things that we do, from helping frontline communities to divestment and climate finance, where not everyone might live by a frontline community, but most of us have some sort of financial resource. And many of our banks invest our saved money in our bank into fossil fuel projects. And our churches or congregational pension funds are often invested into those things. And so what could we do there? Another one that I enjoy as well is called Interfaith Power and Light, and they're in many states around the country, and they're really good about policy. And so if that is something that you are really into, is like, I want to know the bills that are being passed in my state, I want to know which ones I can advocate for, which ones our church can get behind and tell their congregants, different things like that. I think they're 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 so good about that. And another one, this is a very specific one that I enjoy, and I'll use this as an example, but it is called ALAHE, Indigenous Center for Earth Justice. And this is up in Portland, Oregon, run by Randy and Edith Woodley. But there's different organizations like this across the country. They're one of them, but they do this. They have a center on their land, and they try to talk about a more indigenous worldview. And he has some books I recommend reading, but just what does that look like? How do we get away from like this Western, especially Christian in the US worldview that we have, into a worldview of people who were here for a long time? And oftentimes when it comes to the climate crisis, we talk about the world's coming to an end. And Randy Woodley talks about, well, for indigenous people, the world has ended many times over, and we're still here. And so what does it mean to learn from people who have gone through multiple ends, and are still here and continuing on? And so I think it helps give us some more long-term thinking. Indigenous people talk about thinking out to the seventh generation. And oftentimes we're struggling to look past, a few years from now. And so I think looking especially to different indigenous groups and their teachings, and how do we follow those really well, especially the ones of the land we're on, is really good. And I know you said three, but I'll give a fourth one. This is a coalition called People versus Fossil Fuels. And so it's a frontline and indigenous-led coalition of over 1,200 nonprofits from across the United States. And they lift up different frontline and indigenous fights that are happening. And so sometimes there are, different things you can do, ways to take action down in like the Gulf South, where there's doing an LNG build out. Sometimes closer to Appalachia and the Mountain Valley Pipeline, there's even things going on up in Alaska. And so if you follow that coalition, they'll often send out different news alerts or action things that you can do. And so hopefully any one of those things sounded like something you might be interested in. And even if not, it's a launching point, because once you start to see those pop up, you'll start to look at more and find out how they're connected to other places that you might enjoy. But I definitely would recommend looking at like what is one of these near you? Is there a more local organization who only operates in your like city or state or county? And like how do you cultivate some of that being placed base that we talked about today?
William, thank you so much for your time tonight. Could I invite all of our attendees to give William a silent clap for his time and energy and good work?
Thank
It's
you.
just so delightful to hear your good words, William, and also to be just part of your presence, energy, and vitality. It's just very edifying. Thank you very, very much. Before we go tonight, I need to do a Just Faith advertisement and suggest a program for your consideration that I think William would approve of. The title of the program is called Sacred Air, Climate and Energy. It's the second program in Just Faith Ministries' Eco Justice series and explores the impact of the climate crisis on God's creation and God's people. The description goes something like this: in order to discern ways to restore the health of our planet and those who live on it, our small groups that are committed to the program learn about the causes and effects of the climate crisis. Topics include greenhouse gases, air pollution, fossil fuels, renewable energy, the Paris Agreement, and environmental racism. Participants can expect to leave the program better equipped to address the climate crisis, both by mobilizing their communities and by making personal choices that honor God's creation. And Leela is putting a link in the chat if you'd like to learn more. As always, I'd like to invite us to close with prayer. This prayer comes from a collection of prayers called Prayer Without Borders. Let us pray. To have hope is to believe that history continues open to the dream of God and to human creativity. To have hope is to continue affirming that it is possible to dream a different world without hunger, without injustice, without discrimination. To have hope is to be a courier of God and courier of men and women of goodwill, tearing down walls, destroying borders, building bridges. To have hope is to believe in the revolutionary potential of faith, is to leave the door open so that the Spirit can enter and make all things new. To have hope is to believe that life wins over death. To have hope is to believe that hope cannot die, that hope no longer dies. To have hope is to live. Amen. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We're so grateful, and we look forward to seeing you again. Good night.